Character and cast design is super important because you want characters that conflict enough with each other to create interesting scenes and are different enough to create, different voices, because you don't want all your characters to read the same way on the page.
They come from people I want to know. They come from fragments of them come from people, and usually the relationships are inspired by relationships. But I wouldn't have said the characters necessarily do.
If I'm writing a character and I feel, I've seen this person before in some form or another, if it fits too cleanly into an archetype, then they have to go. The character cannot exist.
Strong characters sound like they've been talking all their lives. Characters that sound like they're only talking for the purpose of that scene or something aren't strong characters. You want to be able to imagine a character growing up.
And it's really important when people are, sort of ingesting your story, that they care. Caring about these people, the story is worthless if you haven't created characters that are interesting. They don't have to be likable, just interesting. You have to be interested in where they're going and what they're doing. And if you don't create characters that achieve that, then your story was worthless, basically. They are the foundation of which story is built. Hello and welcome to this particular edition of Just 100 Little Pages. Now, on the last video, I talked about, coming back this time and admitting if I haven't done very much. And in truth, I've done less than I would have liked to have done, because I'm still, ironically, making these videos take so much time that I'm doing less writing as a result, which is irritating, because the thing that was supposed to get me back into writing is actually, in some ways, hindering. That's what I'm discovering. Because, I make the TV rundown videos every other week now, with the intention being to be writing in the weeks in between, but of course now making these in the weeks in between, which means that my, as soon as I finish the rundown, I've then got to be thinking about that week's Just 100 Little Pages. So these might start being a little bit more stripped back going forward, because I think that's probably the best way to go. But what have I done since the last entry, I guess, into this sort of unusually elaborate vlog? Well, the most recent thing that I've been doing, obviously, is preparing the idea, essentially doing in the planning stages. Now, everyone has different strategies for this, and I would certainly never suggest that the way I approach planning a script is the way anyone else should. It works for me in the way that I organize ideas and concepts and structure. So anything I'm about to say, just as a prefix, it totally applies to me and me alone. In the last 2 weeks, what I've been doing, obviously, is developing the idea that I came up with. Now, an idea in itself is usually sort of a thin and sort of vague version of the story. It's a very undefined version of the story. None of the paths are set. You know the A and the Z, but you don't know any of the things in between. You know you've got to get from one to the other, and you haven't yet decided how, usually. That's the point in which I stop looking at story for a little while, and then I switch. And this is, again, just from my perspective, the easiest way I find to approach a script is to then work on the characters once I get to that stage. The reason being is that I find, at least for me, if I do it the other way around, if I define the story and I go through and I say I need this has to happen to this and then this and then this, I find that then I tend to only create characters whose only function is to serve story points I've created. So I'm creating characters that fit into certain slots, and then they tend to be less interesting people. They're two-dimensional. They're not as interesting. Well, there are two things will happen. One is I'll write them solely with that purpose, and I'll give them a character that makes sense for that purpose, and then they'll be the most uninteresting people in the world. Or I'll make them really interesting, and then the problem becomes that the character doesn't, the things that the character needs to do no longer make sense in the story. So I have a purpose for them, and I've given them a character that's so interesting that no longer seems like a thing that person would do, and then it's major rewrites, which is no good either.
I think if you do have to create a character to tell for a story function, to tell part of the story, I think you can potentially still make them interesting with... I think you can still make them interesting with dialogue. You can still make them a good character. I think perhaps the problem is, from an audience point of view, you would go, "That's not. I only really want to see this character in this scenario." Do you know what I mean? You wouldn't want to. Perhaps the character wouldn't be full enough for you to go, I would want to see them. I want to see more of that character. You end up just wanting to see more of that character in that situation.
So no matter how much I put into that, the characters always seem forced when I do it that way around. So my approach, and again, I'm going to really drive this point home, just my approach, is to do the characters first, because what happens then is they inform the story. Ends up being a lot more organic because the characters dictate by their nature what happens in the story. And then they just feel much more natural, and the movements of the script and the progress of the story and the beats all feel like they've come from a real place, you know, from real characters making decisions that make sense for them. And when I create the characters, I find that I start accidentally filling in bits of the where the story is going to go. And I think what it ultimately comes down to is that people are thrust into situations. Situations don't invent people. That's how real life is. So creating the characters that way makes the most logical sense for me. But I have to fully acknowledge that you know, Chris does it quite differently. You know, he creates a story and then thinks of good people, interesting people that fit in it, and his scripts are great. So I acknowledge the other way around absolutely can work. But the way my mind develops thoughts, and the way my mind sort of the way the cogs spin in my head, doing it the other way makes them go backwards, and then they just don't work. So that's what I've been doing. I've been creating characters for this particular story over the last couple of weeks. That's everything that I'm going to talk about for this week. The character profiles obviously are done. I've already started working on the next stage, but I'll talk more about that in the next episode, which is sort of plotting out the story. I'll talk more about how I go about that in the next episode of Just 100 Little Pages. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. One thing that I'm quite fond of doing with my characters as well is giving them contradictions. I think sometimes it's very simple and very easy to create a character that 100% makes sense and the audience completely understand everything they do because they're just logical. They're one person with a very set goal, and that's just what they want, and that's just what the audience sort of follow. And that can be fine depending on the sort of story you're telling, but my tendency is to create a contradiction within the character because people are just the most contradictory things ever created. Human beings were terrible. We say one thing, we do another all the time. So to create more realistic people, what I tend to do is give them a series of character traits that all make sense within each other, and then I throw in one very contradictory thought that the character has, because I just think that's a state we all live in.